Welcome to TaNaCh Talk. I'm your host, William Hall, broadcasting live out of Kingsland, Texas, USA, with another episode of A Rabbi Cross-Examines the New Testament with Rabbi Michael, the man Skobac. Welcome back, sir. It is such a delight. How are you today?
Good morning.
Good morning, Boker Tov to you and everybody else out there. It depends on where you're at. Good morning, good evening, and good night. Sayonara. So, for us, it's good morning, at least. And I'm a little...
Yeah, I do a class at night, but the students in the class are from all over the world. So I don't say good night anymore, or good evening, because there are people that are just waking up when they're coming to my class, and some of them are just, it's 3 o'clock in the morning. So that's what's amazing about the internet. You can literally have people from all over the planet at different times. And so
that is very true.
For us, it's good morning.
Indeed. Indeed. All right. So today, Revelation chapter 12, the fiery red dragon. Oh, scary stuff right there, boss.
Yeah. I'm not enjoying this book at all.
No.
It's too weird for me. But you know what? We're going to get through it.
So even with Daniel, all the weird stories in Daniel, this one is still a little out there for you?
Listen, Daniel is weird. For sure.
Okay.
But, it's like when you have a weird person in your family, you put up with them. They're in your family. But,
that's funny.
When it comes to strangers and, you have much less tolerance for it. And so, for me, Revelation is not in the Bible. And if I was a Christian, I'd be much more invested in somehow making peace with it, but I'm not enjoying it because it's so weird and difficult to understand. And what's interesting is that you mentioned Daniel. Daniel himself was freaked out by some of his visions. There are several times in the book of Daniel where he's scratching his head. And he basically has to get some interpretation of what he saw in his visions from an angel. Daniel at least seems aware of the fact that his visions are weird and that he can't deal with them. But what you find in Revelation is that John always seems nonplussed. I mean, he has these bizarre visions. He never seems bothered by them or puzzled by them. He never scratches his head. He's never asking for help. What am I seeing?
Right.
What does it mean? And so you really end up seeing it. What's interesting is in the Christian commentaries, because the commentaries by Christians are all over the place. And what I'm always amused by, like when I read the comments to these videos that we're doing, is that, many Christians, they assume that their understanding of these chapters is the most obvious thing in the world, and that you're a moron if you don't see it the way they see it. Anyway, I have difficulty with literature that is so fluid and so easily understood on so many different levels that it's hard to really make heads or tails out of it. So, for example, here we begin chapter 12.
Okay.
In verse 1, it says, "A great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun." Now, this sounds like a lyric from, Led Zeppelin. A woman is clothed with the sun. I think it's Stairway to Heaven, and the moon under her feet and a crown of 12 stars on her head. I mean, what in the world does this mean? And what do these symbols mean? And what's going on? Now, it's not as if it's impossible to come up with biblical allusions to these symbols. The question is to know in what direction to go. So, for example, among Christian commentaries to this passage, when it's talking about this woman clothed with the sun, who is this referring to? So many Christian commentaries as we'll see as we go through the chapter, maintain that this woman is really Israel, is the people of Israel. Some limit it, some commentaries limit it. I guess they don't like the idea that it could be all the Jews. So they say, well, it's referring to Jewish believers in Jesus, the Jewish followers of Jesus. Many Christian commentaries say, no, this woman represents the church. Obviously, especially among those Christians who believe that the church is the true Israel. Now, it's interesting that David Stern, in his commentary here to Revelation, argues that this woman cannot be the church at large in this verse, basically because the church at large is mainly Gentile. And he says the reason is because in verse 17, much later on in this chapter, it speaks about the rest of her children, the rest of this woman's children. So Stern takes this, and other commentaries take this to mean that, initially the chapter focuses on this child of the woman. We'll see who that is. But when it speaks about the rest of her children, so Stern takes that to be referring to non-Jews, to Gentiles, and that would be the church. But over here in verse 1, he says that this woman does not represent the church. Some, especially Catholic commentaries, say that the woman here represents Mary, who's the mother of Jesus. And some say all of the above. So it's very interesting. And the reality is that the symbolism is so rich and it's so malleable that it can really refer to anything. It's like, as I mentioned, it's like a spiritual Rorschach test. You basically, in your interpretation of these symbols, you're really saying more about yourself and your own theology rather than the text. So, for example, here in verse 1, it says that the woman has a crown of 12 stars on her head. So some take this reference to 12 stars to be referring to the 12 tribes of Israel. This, again, would be for those who want to see the woman here as representing Israel, whereas others take the 12 stars to be symbolic of the 12 apostles. And so that would be more in line with those who see this symbolism here in verse 1 as speaking about the church. So in verse 2, John says that the woman was with child. The woman was pregnant, great with child, as they say often, and she cried out, being in labor and in pain to give birth. So she's basically suffering through labor and she's going through a painful birth. Now, who is she going to give birth to? And what does it mean that she's in pain and that she's crying out in pain? So John MacArthur, in his commentary here, says, quote, Israel has agonized and suffered for centuries. So again, he sees the woman as representing Israel, and the fact that she's suffering and in pain and she's crying out, he says that represents, that's speaking about all of the suffering that Israel has gone through for centuries. What's interesting is that MacArthur neglects in his commentary to mention that the vast majority of Jewish suffering over these many centuries was at the hands of Christians, was at the hands of the church. The Jews did not suffer for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, from Sikhs or Buddhists or Hindus or Jains or Baha'is. Suffering at the hands of Muslims was limited in terms of time and in terms of scope. Jews were primarily living in Christian lands, and and we've been with Christians much longer than we've been with Muslims. So it's interesting that MacArthur speaks about the historical suffering of Israel. He neglects to mention the source of that suffering. And then MacArthur goes on to say, after speaking about Israel has agonized and suffered for centuries, he says, longing for the Messiah to come and destroy Satan, destroy sin, and destroy death, and usher in the kingdom. Now, of course, this is basically what he's describing is a Christian vision of what the Messiah is supposed to do. If you ask those Jews who suffered for all those centuries what they were looking forward to when the Messiah comes, they would not have said, we're looking forward to the Messiah so he can, destroy Satan and destroy sin and destroy death. That was never the Jewish understanding of what the Messiah is supposed to do. And significantly, if you go to the TaNaCh, to the Hebrew Scriptures, and you just track down, where does the TaNaCh speak about a descendant of King David who will come in the future and do stuff. So what does it describe this descendant of David coming in the future doing? What is going to be the situation when this descendant of David comes in the future? And basically the TaNaCh speaks in terms that are very familiar to Jewish people, because it speaks about at the time when this descendant of King David comes in the future, there's going to be an ingathering of the Jewish exiles from around the world, a return to the land of Israel, a restoration of the Holy Temple in Jerusalem, basically peace for the Jewish people living in the land of Israel, the spreading of the knowledge of God to all of the non-Jews in the world, which will result in world peace and universal disarmament. I mean, that's basically the vision that Jews have had of what's going to happen when the Messiah comes. But none of these passages that speak about the coming of a descendant of David in the future speak about him destroying Satan or destroying sin or destroying death. This is not the vision that Jews have had. And so when MacArthur says that Jews have suffered for, centuries and centuries, longing for the Messiah to come, that's true. But he goes on to describe a Christian vision of Messiah, not a Jewish vision of Messiah. So in verse 3, John goes on in his vision and says, another sign appeared. So the first sign is this woman, whatever she represents. And then in verse 3, another sign appeared in heaven, a great red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns. And on his heads were 7 diadems. Now, virtually all Christians understand this dragon, which actually comes up, I think, 13 times in the book of Revelation. This 13 times this dragon is mentioned. All Christians really understand this as symbolizing Satan. And this is something which is non-disputable, because later on in the chapter, in verse 9, we're going to see that this identification is made explicitly, that the dragon is explicitly identified as Satan, as the tempter and basically the Satan. Now, David Stern interestingly insists that the 7 heads and the 10 horns that is described here for this dragon equate. It's the word he uses. They equate the dragon, with the 4th beast in Daniel chapter 7, verse 7. Now, Daniel's beast is described as having immense iron teeth, and then having 10 horns. But there's nothing in Daniel about this fourth beast having 7 heads. And according to rabbinic tradition, this fourth beast does not represent Satan. It represents the empire of Rome, the Roman Empire, specifically the countries in the Roman Empire over history that are dominated by Christianity. So it basically is referring to the Christian West that has been the major political force in the world over the past 2,000 years. So the Talmud refers to it as Rome or Edom, but it's really speaking about the spread of Roman Christianity to become the dominant force in the world over the past 2,000 years. And that's how Jewish thinking understands this fourth beast, that it represents the Roman Empire. And this really is in line with the way the other beasts are seen. So, for example, the first beast, which is really a lion with wings of an eagle, is seen as representing Babylon, the kingdom of Babylon. The second beast is basically seen as a bear, and that represents the kingdom of Persia. The third beast represents a leopard, and that represents the kingdom of Greece. So you see these world powers, these kingdoms, these world powers. And the fourth, from a Christian point of view, would go from Babylon, Persia, Greece to Satan. Whereas in the Jewish understanding, it's Babylon, Persia, Greece, and then Rome, which would be the fourth major, essentially, world power. Now, in verse 4, the vision of John goes on to say that the tail of this dragon swept away 1/3 of the stars of heaven and threw them to the earth. And he says that the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she gave birth, he might devour the child. Sounds very malevolent, this dragon. So this again is a verse that is so wild and so open to different ways of interpreting it. What does it mean that the tail of the dragon swept away 1/3 of the stars of heaven? What in the world does that mean? So probably many, or if not most, Christians take this as referring to the initial revolt of Satan against God. And at that time, he took 1/3 of the angels from heaven with him. And now he's leading these demons in his rebellion against God. Some people see this alluded to in 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 4. But this is a very common Christian belief, that Satan is an angel that rebelled against God and didn't only rebel by himself, but took away 1/3 of the heavenly angels with him to lead these demons in revolt against God and God's plans for history. And so here in this verse, what the dragon wants to do ultimately is to devour this child. Now, ostensibly, the child this woman will give birth to is going to be the Messiah, which Christians believe is Jesus. So that's the plan of the dragon. The dragon does not want to see the birth of the Messiah, so the dragon's plan is to devour the child when the child is born. Now, in the TaNaCh, important to say this, in TaNaCh, there is no massive rebellion of angels against God that are then cast down from heaven. This is simply not in the TaNaCh. Christianity tends really towards dualism, when Satan leads an opposing team against God. This is the Christian view of reality, that there's God and then there is Satan, who essentially is leading a team of other rebellious angels that are fighting against God. And in reality, Satan is on God's team. This is the TaNaCh, Jewish biblical view of Satan, is that he's not on an opposing team against God. He is on God's team, and he advances God's purposes on earth. He is essentially working for God. And what is he doing to do this? How does Satan do this? Well, the word Satan in Hebrew, Satan, basically means to block, to impede, to be an obstacle, to be a roadblock. So the whole job of Satan is to be an adversary to human beings, to tempt human beings, to challenge human beings, to get in the way of our spiritual progress. And this is for our benefit. This is for our benefit, because we can grow by overcoming his resistance, or overcoming the resistance of these challenges, these temptations, and these impediments. That's the whole purpose of God sending this opposing force to us in the world. God wants our spiritual progress to have a loyal opposition, to have resistance. Because as we know from people who go to the gym, the only way you can build muscles is by overcoming resistance. You're not going to grow muscles by picking up a piece of paper. So we need resistance in life, and that's the purpose of Satan. So in each instance, when you go through the TaNaCh, in every instance where Satan is mentioned, he's under the authority and direction of God. He's never portrayed as independent and working at cross purposes with God. So for example, in the book of Eov, in the book of Job, God allows Satan to torment Job, to afflict Job, but not to kill him. God makes it very clear that Satan is not to kill Job. Killing him would obviously not accomplish anything. It would not help Job to grow. Again, the whole purpose of Satan, is to help people grow. By just killing someone, you're destroying any possibility or potential for them to grow. So what's interesting is that the verse here in Revelation, where Satan sets out to kill this baby, right, or kill anyone for that matter, would be ludicrous. So the idea from a TaNaCh biblical point of view that Satan runs around trying to kill people, that would work at cross purposes from what God wants. If God is sending the Messiah to redeem Israel and to redeem the world ultimately, why would God send an angel? We know that, again, Satan is an angel of God. We see this in the first chapter of Job. So why would God send an angel to destroy this Redeemer? Again, in the TaNaCh, the Satan is simply an angel working for God. So in the TaNaCh view, this verse would be impossible, that the birth of the Messiah is imminent, and God's going to send an angel, here the angel Satan, to devour the child. That's absurd. And so it's clearly, pointing to the Christian idea here of Satan, which is that Satan operates independently of God. That's the only way you can understand this verse. God is not going to send an angel to destroy the one he just sent to redeem the world. So you have to have here in this verse a non-biblical understanding of Satan. You have to have essentially a Christian understanding of a Satan, a satanic force that operates independently of God. And again, as I mentioned, this is a dualistic view of the world. But again, the message of the Torah is that there are no other independent powers than God in the world. The Torah is very clear. Torah tells us, Ein od milvado, there is nothing other than the Creator. God is the controller, the ruler of everything. As Isaiah says, God creates light and darkness, good and evil. Everything emanates from God. There isn't a separate force that is competing against God. In verse 5, we're told that she gave birth to a son. So finally, this woman gives birth to a son, a male child. I'm not sure why John had to say that. Usually a son is a male child, who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. And the child was caught up to God and to his throne. And this is a very curious verse. I'm going to read it again. The woman gave birth to a son, a male child, who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron, and the child was caught up to God and to his throne. Now, Christians maintain, obviously, that this verse refers to Jesus, and it describes what Jesus is supposed to do as the Messiah, which is ultimately to rule. But it's really, this idea of ruling is more of a Jewish understanding of Messiah than a Christian one. Again, the description here of this baby, of this child, doesn't mention the Christian task, the Christian purpose of the Messiah. It doesn't say here that this child is supposed to die as a sacrifice to atone for sin and to be resurrected to conquer death. It speaks about the Messiah in very biblical Jewish terms, that the Messiah is going to reign as a king. So this verse begins with the birth of the child, but then strangely it skips his entire life and continues with the supposed ascension of Jesus to heaven at the end of his life, which again is something the TaNaCh never describes. So what this verse says about Mashiach, about Messiah, interestingly, Jesus never fulfilled, meaning it says he's going to rule with a rod of iron, but Jesus never did that. Jesus was never anointed as a king. Jesus never reigned as a king. Jesus never served as a Messiah, as an anointed ruler, as an anointed king. And so it's strange that the verse speaks about the birth of Jesus, skips his entire life, and then picks up with his ascension to heaven. It's sort of a bizarre verse. In verse 6, the vision goes on and says, "And the woman fled into the wilderness where she had a place prepared by God, so that there she might be nourished for 1,260 days." Now, if this is describing Satan's war against Israel, again, most of the Christian commentaries see this woman as representing Israel on some level, and if it's referring to the dragon essentially attacking her and wanting to attack her, so she flees to the wilderness where there's a place prepared by God for her. So again, if we to understand Satan's designs on Israel as essentially the war against Israel over history to wipe Israel out, this verse doesn't really make sense, because in all of Jewish history, there was never a place where Jews would be at peace and safe from their enemies for a period of 1,260 days. I mean, you could say that in the course of Jewish history, there have been some countries where the Jews received safe harbor. I mean, for the most part, Jews in North America have been fairly safe. I say fairly safe. It hasn't been a bed of roses. But if you want to look at North America as a harbor, a safe harbor for the Jewish people, it's been for hundreds of years. So it's hard to understand what it means to say that there was a safe place prepared for Israel for a period of 1,260 days. Some more narrowly interpret this as only referring to the escape of Jewish Christians, Jewish believers in Jesus, from Jerusalem at the time right prior to the destruction of Jerusalem. So we have a tradition, or at least the church has a tradition, that many of the Jewish followers of Jesus escaped to a place called Pella in Jordan. But again, there's no evidence that they were only safe there for 3.5 years or 1,260 days. So this, again, is a verse that's not really easy to pin down. In verse 7, John says there was a war in heaven. There's a war in heaven. Now the chapter gets really exciting. And Michael and his angels waging war with the dragon, and the dragon and his angels waged war. So this seems to be like a big conflagration up in heaven. And we know if we go to the book of Daniel, in, let's say, chapter 12, verse 1, we're told that Michael is described as a special protector of God's people, of Israel. So again, for those Christians who don't believe in replacement theology, so Michael here is a protector of biblical Israel. And for Christians who are into replacement theology, so Michael here is protector of the church, who they see as the new Israel or the real Israel, however you want to parse it. In verse 8, we're told that they were not strong enough, meaning that the minions of the dragon, of Satan in heaven, in their fight against Michael and the other angels, they were not strong enough, and there was no longer a place found for them in heaven, meaning that Michael and his angels are victorious, and they expel Satan and his demons from heaven. And again, this is going to be spelled out in the next verse, in verse 9. So verse 9 says, so the great dragon was cast out. The great dragon, Satan, was cast out of heaven. That serpent of old, called the devil and Satan. So here you see the explicit identification of the dragon is called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world. He was cast to the earth, and his angels were cast out with him. So this is basically the expulsion of Satan and his demons from heaven. The word devil is from the Greek diabolos, which means a slanderer or accuser. And the word Satan, as we saw before, means an adversary or a tempter. It's interesting that the Talmud basically combines the jobs of really three of these beings. The Talmud speaks about the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination, and the Satan, the Satan, and the Malach HaMavet, the angel of death. And the Talmud speaks about that there is this angel serves the purpose of tempting people, of really tempting them to sin. And then this angel serves as the prosecutor in heaven, making the case against this person. And then this angel carries out the death sentence against people. Now, John goes on in verse 10 to say, then I heard a loud voice saying in heaven, now salvation and strength and the kingdom of our God and the power of his Messiah have come, for the answer of our brethren who accused them before our God and has been cast down. So we saw, if you remember, last week in chapter 11, verse 15, and here again in Revelation chapter 12, verse 10, we see that there is a distinguishing between God and the Messiah. Again, here it says, the kingdom of our God and the power of his Messiah. It doesn't say the kingdom of the Messiah God or God the Messiah. It doesn't identify God with the Messiah as Christians do. It distinguishes here God from the Messiah, which is exactly what we saw last week. And again, we've seen this throughout the entire Christian scriptures. The vast majority of passages very much distinguish between Jesus and God. We saw less than a handful of passages where it was murky, but 95% plus make it very clear that the Messiah is not God. And this is again in line with the way TaNaCh presents the Messiah, always very clearly distinguished from God. So, for example, in the prophet Hosea, chapter 3, verse 5, the prophet says, "Afterward, the children of Israel shall return and seek the Lord their God and David their king." So there is the Lord their God, the creator, and then there is David their king, who represents, this is the Messiah. "And they shall fear the Lord and his goodness in the latter days." It doesn't say they're going to fear David or the Messiah. We only have fear of God. We only have reverence and fear. We only worship the Creator. And so the TaNaCh makes it very clear that the Messiah is not God. And then in verse 11, John says, "And they overcame him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, and they did not love their lives to the death." Now, this is again a verse which is not clear. Who is it that overcame him, ostensibly overcame the dragon, the Satan, by the blood of the Lamb? Who was it that overcame him? So this seems to be saying that after Satan and his minions were cast out of heaven, the believers in the Messiah, which means Christendom, basically were able to thwart him down here in the earthly realm by resisting Satan through the blood of Jesus and by their testimony that Jesus is the Messiah. It's not such a clear idea, because even in the Christian Bible we see that after the death of Jesus and his alleged resurrection, the disciples are not able to resist Satan. Paul says, for example, that he wanted to go here, but he was prevented by Satan. So this is not a foolproof, slam dunk kind of ability to overcome Satan by the blood of the Lamb. It seems to be limited, at least at this point in history. So the problem is, aside from forgiving sin, the death of the Messiah is for the purpose of overcoming Satan. That's what it seems to be from this verse. Again, the verse says that they, ostensibly the followers of Jesus, overcame him, the dragon, Satan, by the blood of the Lamb, by the blood of the sacrificed Messiah, and by the word of their testimony. So it seems that this is a second purpose for the death of the Messiah, not only to allow for the forgiveness and atonement for sins, but to help overcome Satan. Now, the problem is that Christians struggle to find a TaNaCh source for the idea that Mashiach will die to atone for their sins. As we all know, they basically have only one source, which is the 53rd chapter of Isaiah, and that is, let's say, to say the most generously, not clear. The most generous way of putting it. That's the one source they have, and it's certainly not clear. But they are out of business. Christians are out of business when it comes to getting a biblical source for this idea that the Messiah comes to destroy the devil. That you're not going to find anywhere in TaNaCh, even with the most sort of, let's say, far-fetched interpretation. Even with that, you're not going to get any biblical source. In verse 12, John goes on to say, "Therefore rejoice, O heavens, and you who dwell in them. Woe to the inhabitants of the earth and the sea, for the devil has come down to you, having great wrath, because he knows that he has a short time. So first of all, let's just back up for a moment and just mention, just to be aware of this, that there is very obviously an out of proportion, a disproportionate focus, emphasis on Satan and the devil in the Christian scriptures as opposed to in the TaNaCh. In the Christian scriptures, you see mentioning of Satan, of the devil, approximately, if I remember correctly, 200 times. We have to remember that the Christian scriptures are quite a bit shorter than the TaNaCh. So the TaNaCh is a much larger work, and you would expect to have a greater number of references to Satan, to the devil. But the reality is that you have just a handful of references in TaNaCh to Satan, to the devil. It's interesting. Why did that change so dramatically? Why in the TaNaCh is Satan a relatively, rare appearance? Relatively rare appearance. Whereas in the Christian scriptures, it's all over the place. All over the place. Now, the description here in this verse of the Satan is not in line with the concept of Satan being an angel working for God. That's for sure. That this angel, that this Satan here, once it was thrown out of heaven, came to dwell on earth and to make life super miserable for human beings with great wrath, because simply he knows his time is short, meaning that he's here a completely malevolent being that just has in mind one thing, which is to destroy, which again is not in line with the way the TaNaCh pictures the Satan as essentially an angel working for God, and that would never be to simply destroy. According to Chazal, according to the rabbinic sages, the truth is that Satan actually desires man to overcome him, because Satan understands the nature of his assignment. Satan understands the nature of his mission. The Satan understands that he is sent only to help human beings reach their potential. So in effect, the sages tell us that Satan is rooting for us to overcome him. Satan would be happy and thrilled if we were able to resist his temptations. Because again, that's what God wants. And the Satan, as an agent of God, wants to fulfill God's intentions. Verse 13 says that when the dragon saw he had been cast to the earth, he persecuted the woman who gave birth to the male child. Now, one question which to me is not clear is, when did this take place? When in the history of the world did this take place, that Satan was cast down from heaven? Did it take place in the very, very beginning of the creation story? Did it take place later in history at some point? It's certainly not clear from this chapter in Revelation. It sounds like from this verse here in chapter 12, verse 13, it sounds like the persecution of Israel only begins after the birth of Jesus, meaning once Jesus is born, Satan now attacks the woman, attacks Israel, and that doesn't make sense, because we know that anti-Jewish persecution goes back much, much earlier than the birth of Jesus and the birth of Christianity. We know that Isaac was contending with the Philistines, who took the wells that he had dug and that his father had dug, and they filled the wells up with sand and with earth. Simply a blatant hatred. And then we know that in Egypt, although Joseph had saved Egypt, the Egyptians turn on the relatives of Joseph. Basically, it says that the Pharaoh did not know Joseph, didn't remember anything about Joseph, and basically came up with a plan of genocide and persecution against the family of Joseph. And then we know that when the Jews left Egypt, the Amalekites attacked the rear guard, the stragglers, the women and the children and the sick people were attacked by the Amalekites, who became the historical arch enemy of the Jewish people. And then we know, of course, the Babylonians wreaked havoc upon the Jewish people. They destroyed the first temple. They took us into exile. And then, of course, the Greek Empire, with its domination of the Jews living in the land of Israel, its imposition of Greek Hellenistic culture upon the Jewish people. There was tremendous persecution and hatred of Jews way before the advent of Christianity. So this might give some ammunition to those who view the woman as representing the Christian church. So now this would make sense. If the woman is the Christian church, so that's when the dragon would begin persecuting with the birth of the Christian Messiah. So this is, again, a question that has a big, it's just not clear at all. In verse 14, we're told the woman was given 2 wings of a great eagle, that she might fly into the wilderness to her place where she is nourished for a time and times and half a time from the presence of the serpent. So it's not exactly clear what this means. Most see this as a reference to God historically protecting Israel, but then why would it be only for 3.5 years? And this is what drives some Christian commentaries to focus the drama of this chapter not on the broad sweep of Jewish history, but on a more limited drama of the so-called 7 years of the Great Tribulation. And that would basically narrow down the persecution and the suffering to a smaller window. That might make more sense. But again, it's difficult to just simply narrow down the persecution of Satan, because we know that the historical persecution of the Jewish people was centuries, centuries, and centuries. Why focus on 7.5 years or 7 years? It's hard to understand. In verse 15, we're almost at the end now. We're told that the serpent spewed water out of his mouth like a flood after the woman, that he might cause her to be carried away by the flood. Now, none of the Christian commentaries seem to know what this is talking about. Jack Van Impe, in his commentary, interestingly sees this idea of a flood coming out of the mouth of Satan as the spread of anti-Jewish slurs and propaganda internationally throughout the world. Again, why limit this to a short period of time? If it is talking about anti-Jewish propaganda and slurs and anti-Semitism, this has been going on for centuries, not just this period of 3.5 years. And then in verse 16, we're told the earth helped the woman, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed the flood, swallowed all this water that came out of the mouth of the dragon, which the dragon had spewed out of its mouth. I don't think any Christian has a clue what this is really talking about. And this is evident by the lack of commentaries by Christians who normally are very loquacious and write a tremendous amount about the text of Revelation. There's very little commentary here because I don't think anyone really understands what's going on. It's as if, apparently, that the earth swallowed up the comments of these Christians when it comes to this passage. It's just not clear. And finally, in verse 17, the end of the chapter, the dragon was enraged with the woman, and he went to make war with the rest of her offspring, who keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus the Messiah. Apparently, this is speaking about non-Jews. Again, if the previous references to the woman and her child were speaking about the Jewish people and Jews, it seems that if there's anyone else that's going to be discussed, it's going to be the non-Jewish, the Gentile church, but it's not clear then what is meant by saying they keep the commandments of God. Normally, the Gentile church over the centuries has not kept the commandments of God, but I'm sure that any Christians today, non-Jewish Christians who try to be Torah observant, and there are movements in Christianity that try to observe the Torah, they might see themselves here. They might read themselves back into this verse. Now, I'll just end by pointing out that David Stern in his commentary has a verse 18 for this chapter where the dragon is standing on the seashore, but I have no idea where he gets this from. I didn't see it anywhere else that people speak about an 18th verse. So it's possible that it's simply a mistake that crept its way into David Stern's commentary. So that's all she wrote for chapter 12, and I'm looking forward, William,
Yes, sir.
Habibi, to trying out lucky number 13 for us next time.
That sounds good, and it kind of makes you wonder. Like the last 6 verses in Mark, I think that was added later. Maybe this is the approach they took. Put it in, see if nobody notices it, and if they doesn't, just leave it. I don't know. Who knows, right? So very good. Well, awesome teaching today, Rabbi. I appreciate your time for sure, and thank you all for tuning in. We look forward to seeing you all same time, same place next week, Hashem willing. Peace out, everybody. See you also tonight with Rabbi Federow. Take care, everybody. Peace. Bye.
All the best. Have a great day.
You too. Shalom, my dear friends. Hope this message finds you well. If you like the way this channel is going and the channel has been a blessing to you, please consider supporting the channel by going to the website, TaNaChTalk.com, TANACHTALK.com. Thank you once again for your time and for supporting TaNaCh Talk. Shalom.